June 5, 1942. The Pacific Ocean. Endless, silent, scarred by war. The horizon still burns from yesterday's fury. Shattered fragments of steel and fuel drift across the waves where proud Japanese carriers once ruled. The air smells of oil, salt, and smoke. Aboard the Japanese battleship Yamato, officers gather around a chart table. Their expressions are grave, their uniforms smudged with ash from distant explosions. The reports are impossible. All four fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lost at Midway. The enemy's air power, they believe, must be crippled as well. The Americans have paid dearly. In Tokyo, newspapers will soon celebrate a strategic withdrawal. But within the Imperial Navy, officers whisper another truth: that the Empire's most trusted weapon, its striking arm of carriers, has vanished in a single blinding day. Weeks pass. Intelligence begins to filter through the chaos of war. Reconnaissance aircraft return with photographs, gray hulls on the horizon, flight decks bustling with aircraft. American carriers sailing again. The Yorktown, believed sunk. The Enterprise, scarred but alive. New ships already under construction. The shock is quiet, almost reverent. Japan's officers stare at the images, realizing a terrifying truth: their enemy does not stay dead. Before the war began, Japan believed it had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. The age of the battleship, the towering symbol of sea power, was ending. In its place rose something new: the aircraft carrier, sleek, fast, and deadly at a distance. Throughout the 1930s, Japanese naval planners studied every carrier doctrine they could find. They examined British operations in the Mediterranean, American carrier trials in the Pacific, and the lessons of interwar exercises. By 1941, Japan's Kido Butai, the combined fleet's carrier strike force, had become the most formidable naval aviation arm in existence. 6 fleet carriers, hundreds of experienced pilots, and a command structure built for decisive preemptive strikes. The architect of this vision was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. A gambler and realist, he understood that Japan could never match the United States in industrial capacity. Victory, he believed, depended on one thing: destroying the American fleet so completely and so suddenly that Washington would have no choice but to negotiate. That logic shaped everything that followed. On December 7, 1941, as the rising sun broke over Oahu, Japan unleashed the most daring carrier assault in history. Waves of aircraft swept over Pearl Harbor, striking American battleships in their berths, sinking or crippling 8 of them. Oil fires turned the harbor black. Over 2,400 Americans died. But amid the smoke and chaos, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port. Their survival would change the entire course of the war. While the Japanese public hailed Pearl Harbor as divine victory, Yamamoto knew the danger of what had begun. The attack had awoken a nation whose power lay not only in its fleet, but in its factories, its labor force, and its determination. Japan had won a lightning victory, but against an enemy that could rebuild faster than any nation in history. Through the winter of 1942, the Kido Butai ranged across the Pacific unchecked. Rabaul, Wake, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies fell one after another. Japanese carrier pilots, veterans of years of training, operated with precision unmatched by any navy. Each strike reaffirmed their confidence. The Americans were disorganized, their fleet too slow to recover. Yet beneath that confidence lay a critical flaw. Japan's shipyards were small, its industrial base fragile. Every carrier, every trained pilot, was irreplaceable. The United States, meanwhile, was mobilizing at a scale the world had never seen. In December 1941, American shipyards produced a handful of major warships each month. By mid-1943, they would launch entire carrier task forces in a single season. But in early 1942, the Imperial Navy could not see that far ahead. Its leadership believed that by the time American industry awoke, Japan would already control the Pacific. That belief guided the next offensive, a plan to draw out and destroy the remaining U.S. carriers in one decisive battle. The target was Midway, a small coral atoll northwest of Hawaii. Strategically insignificant on a map, it became the pivot of the Pacific War. The Japanese planned to lure the Americans into a trap, crush their carriers, and secure dominance over the Central Ocean. The operation was ambitious and fatally overconfident. As the Imperial Navy prepared its strike force, Yamamoto felt the pressure of time closing in. He had promised the Emperor 6 months of unbroken victory. After that, he warned, Japan's fate would depend on luck. That deadline was now approaching. And far across the ocean, in the darkened basements of Pearl Harbor's rebuilt intelligence center, a group of American cryptanalysts was about to change the war entirely. The enemy they were about to face would not be caught off guard again. In the weeks leading to Midway, Japan believed its plan was flawless. Its fleet outnumbered the Americans. Its pilots were seasoned from years of conquest. Its carrier air wings had never been defeated in open battle. What the Japanese command did not know was that their greatest advantage, secrecy, had already been lost. Inside a small, windowless building at Pearl Harbor known as Station Hypo, U.S. Navy codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval cipher JN-25. Working in shifts around the clock, they had uncovered fragments of orders, coordinates, and logistics details. One coded reference, AF, appeared repeatedly. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team suspected it meant Midway. To confirm, they devised a trap. Midway's garrison was ordered to broadcast an unencrypted message that its water purification system had failed. Hours later, Japanese intelligence intercepted it and reported that AF was short on water. The deception worked. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now knew exactly where Japan would strike. While the Japanese armada steamed toward Midway in 4 separate task groups, American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown waited in ambush. Yorktown, heavily damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier, had been expected to spend months in dock. Instead, American shipyard crews at Pearl Harbor worked around the clock, 1,400 men laboring without pause, to return her to sea in just 72 hours. Her decks were still smelling of paint when she sailed. That single act of industrial defiance would become a symbol of the American war effort. A nation capable of resurrecting ships faster than Japan could replace them. When the fleets finally met in early June 1942, the outcome defied every expectation. The Japanese, confident their enemies were unaware, launched their first strike against Midway's airfields. Yet even as their planes returned for rearming, American carrier aircraft appeared over the horizon. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown descended in a deadly formation, catching the Japanese carriers in mid-reload. In minutes, the pride of the Kido Butai, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and later Hiryu, erupted into flame. The destruction was total. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, over 250 aircraft, and its most experienced pilots. The Americans, though bloodied, had achieved the impossible, turning the tide of the Pacific War in a single day. For Japan, the shock went deeper than the numbers. It was psychological. For months, their victories had seemed unstoppable. Midway was supposed to confirm their dominance. Instead, it exposed the fragility beneath their confidence. The Imperial Navy had no reserve carriers to replace the fallen, no surplus pilots to train new squadrons, and no industrial engine to match America's pace. In Tokyo, news of the defeat was softened for the public. Official bulletins spoke of temporary setbacks. Yet, within naval circles, the loss of 4 carriers was understood for what it was: an irreversible wound. Yamamoto's plan to end the war quickly had failed. Across the Pacific, the United States did not celebrate openly either. The cost had been high. Yorktown was struck by Japanese torpedoes and sank days later. But her sacrifice was not in vain. America had proven that its carriers could strike back, survive, and be replaced. By late 1942, the implications became clear. The Essex-class carriers were rolling off the docks in Newport News, Brooklyn, and San Francisco. Shipyards that once built passenger liners were now producing warships at a rate no empire could match. What Japan believed destroyed could be reborn. Stronger, faster, and in greater numbers. And when those resurrected carriers returned to the Pacific later that year, the men of the Imperial Navy would see something they had never imagined possible. The same ships they had sunk, the same names they had crossed from their ledgers, sailing once again toward battle. The era of Japanese naval dominance was ending. And it would end not through one battle, but through the unstoppable rhythm of American industry and resolve. The human angle, disbelief, and the shattering of confidence. For years, Japanese naval officers had believed that their training and discipline gave them an invincible edge. Their pilots, molded through grueling selection and years of flight practice, were considered the finest in the world. Every man aboard the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had grown up with the belief that the Empire of Japan was destined to rule the Pacific. When Midway ended, that belief cracked. Yet, the true shock came months later, when intelligence reports began circulating within the combined fleet. Reports of American carriers operating once more. At first, they were dismissed as rumor. The Yorktown had been hit multiple times, burned, and then torpedoed. It was impossible she had returned, but photographic evidence, radio intercepts, and pilot encounters confirmed the unthinkable. Enterprise and Hornet were leading fresh task forces in the Solomon Islands. Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded the carriers at Pearl Harbor and Midway, received the reports in silence. To him and his staff, it felt like fighting ghosts. Men who had watched their enemies burn now saw those same ships and squadrons reborn. This disbelief carried through every level of the fleet. Veterans of Pearl Harbor whispered that America's steel demons could not be killed, that their factories were as alive as their soldiers. For a military culture steeped in fatalism and honor, the idea of an enemy who refused to stay defeated was deeply unsettling. The psychological shock was not theatrical. It was real, and it spread like a shadow over the morale of the Imperial Navy. The industrial angle, shipyards of resurrection, the speed of American recovery was more than military efficiency. It was industrial brilliance. While Japan's shipyards in Kure, Yokosuka, and Nagasaki worked with limited resources and manual labor, American naval yards became machines of rebirth. When Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor after the Coral Sea, her decks were torn open, her boilers damaged, and her communications nearly destroyed. In Japan, a carrier in such condition would have been out of service for months. But the United States operated differently. Within hours, over 1,000 welders, electricians, and engineers descended upon the damaged ship. Work continued day and night under floodlights. Civilians, naval engineers, and even off-duty sailors joined in. Supply convoys brought new steel, turbines, and parts that had already been pre-manufactured. The workers did not stop. Meals were delivered to the decks, and men slept beside their tools. In just 72 hours, Yorktown was refueled, refitted, and rearmed. She sailed again, into the jaws of Midway. This pattern repeated across the war. American shipyards at Mare Island, Puget Sound, and Brooklyn became production miracles. By late 1942, they were launching new Essex-class carriers every few months, vast floating air bases that could carry twice the planes of Japan's lost carriers. Meanwhile, Japan's shipbuilders struggled under shortages of steel, labor, and fuel. The Imperial Navy's logistical command still operated with pre-war assumptions that each ship would last years, not months. America had learned something Japan never intended to teach: that the key to victory was not just courage at sea, but the ability to rebuild faster than the enemy could destroy. The technological angle, damage control, radar, and design philosophy technology was another battlefield, and it too reflected the nations that wielded it. Japanese carriers were designed for offense. Light, fast, with large aircraft capacity but minimal internal armor. Every kilogram was calculated for range and striking power. Their hangars stored fuel and munitions close together, separated only by thin bulkheads. This made them deadly to others, but also fragile to fire. American carriers, by contrast, carried heavier armor and more advanced fire suppression systems. Their crews were trained relentlessly in damage control, sealing compartments, cutting fuel lines, and containing fires before they spread. At Midway, these differences became decisive. Japanese carriers, hit during rearming operations, turned into infernos within minutes. American ships, struck by torpedoes and bombs, managed to stay afloat long enough for Cruz to fight the flames. Yorktown herself survived multiple hits before finally succumbing. Then came radar. By 1942, U.S. carriers and cruisers were increasingly equipped with radar-directed fire control and early warning systems. Japan lagged behind, relying instead on optical spotting and radio reports. This technological edge allowed American fleets to detect incoming aircraft long before visual contact, a decisive advantage in night battles and poor weather. To the Japanese Navy, this seemed almost supernatural. Pilots returning from missions reported being intercepted from beyond sight. Battles that once relied on skill and instinct now favored machinery, mathematics, and mass production. Technology had tilted the scales, and with it, the balance of the Pacific. Each of these angles, human, industrial, and technological, revealed a single truth that Japan could no longer ignore. The Americans were fighting a different kind of war, one of endurance, reinvention, and innovation. And when the next battles erupted across the Solomon Islands, that truth would become undeniable, written in fire, steel, and the roar of engines over Guadalcanal. The tactical angle, the evolution of American carrier warfare in the early months of 1942, the U.S. Navy's carrier doctrine was still experimental. Commanders like Frank Jack Fletcher and Raymond Spruance were learning in real time, studying each battle, each loss, and adjusting their tactics with cold precision. At Coral Sea, the Americans had fought the first naval engagement in history where opposing fleets never saw each other. Only aircraft met in combat. The lessons were harsh, but invaluable. By the time of Midway, American carrier tactics had evolved into something both flexible and ruthless. They learned to disperse their carriers rather than cluster them, minimizing risk. They refined coordinated attacks, dive bombers and torpedo planes striking together to overwhelm defenses. Radio coordination between air groups improved. Each operation became faster, more synchronized, and more resilient to chaos. The Japanese, by contrast, remained bound to their pre-war doctrine, elaborate, rigid, and reliant on perfect execution. Their commanders favored complex battle plans that assumed complete control of timing and information. Once that precision was disrupted, as it was at Midway, confusion spread quickly. After the loss at Midway, American carriers did something extraordinary. They immediately shifted from defense to offense. Within weeks, Enterprise and Hornet were steaming toward the Solomon Islands, launching raids on enemy positions. Instead of retreating to repair and regroup, they pressed forward. This adaptability became the new signature of the U.S. Navy. Carrier warfare was no longer about single decisive blows. It was about constant pressure, coordinated logistics, and never giving the enemy time to breathe. At Guadalcanal, in August 1942, this doctrine would be tested, and the Japanese would discover that their opponents had learned faster than anyone imagined. The leadership angle. Yamamoto's realization admiral. Isoroku Yamamoto was no ordinary officer. He had studied in the United States, understood its industrial depth, and warned his superiors that Japan could never win a prolonged war against such an enemy. "I shall run wild for 6 months," he had said. "But after that, I can promise nothing." By late 1942, those 6 months were over. From his flagship, the battleship Yamato, Yamamoto received reports that chilled even his disciplined composure. American carriers, believed sunk or crippled, were striking again near Guadalcanal. Japanese naval air groups, once invincible, were losing aircraft and pilots faster than they could be replaced. The admiral understood what few around him dared to say. Japan's strategy had failed not because of lack of bravery or skill, but because of the nature of modern war itself. Industrial might now decided destiny. Yamamoto's subordinates, steeped in traditional Bushido ideals, still spoke of valor and decisive victory. But he knew that courage could not replace production. Every pilot lost took years to replace. Every carrier sunk was irreplaceable. America, meanwhile, was already constructing fleets larger than the entire Imperial Navy. He began to see Japan's situation in grim clarity, not as a series of lost battles, but as a slow erosion of the very foundation of its power. Yamamoto's correspondence in those months, though coded and cautious, reveals deep frustration and resignation. He knew the enemy he once underestimated was transforming before his eyes. When news arrived that the Yorktown's name had been reassigned to a newly launched carrier, faster, stronger, with twice the capacity, even Japan's most loyal officers felt the weight of inevitability. The strategic angle, a war Japan could no longer replace. By late 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy still held vast territory, from the Dutch East Indies to the Gilbert Islands. But those conquests hid a fatal truth. Japan's empire was overextended, its lifelines thin, its oil reserves dwindling. Carrier warfare, which had once been its greatest weapon, now became its greatest liability. Every operation consumed thousands of gallons of aviation fuel and required constant resupply from tankers Japan could scarcely protect. Replacement aircraft were few, and pilots were increasingly green, rushed through training to fill gaps left by Midway's dead. The United States, by contrast, was reaching full industrial stride. Dozens of new carriers, destroyers, and escort ships left the docks monthly. The Navy's pilot training program produced aviators by the thousands. Air groups were no longer built around elite veterans. They were rotating machines of experience, training, and adaptation. This asymmetry turned every engagement into a battle of attrition that Japan could not afford. Each lost carrier, each veteran pilot shot down, was gone forever. America could replace both in weeks. Strategically, Japan's naval command still clung to the idea of a decisive battle, a single crushing victory that would force the U.S. to negotiate. But that moment never came. Instead, American carriers began to appear in every corner of the Pacific, striking at islands Japan had thought secure. Each reappearance carried psychological weight. To the Japanese observer, it seemed that the same enemy ships were everywhere at once. The truth was simpler. There were just more of them every month. Japan had entered a war of industrial endurance, and endurance was precisely what America had in limitless supply. The realization settled like a cold fog across the Imperial Navy. Their enemy had become what they most feared: tireless, unbroken, and reborn from its own wreckage. The shock that began at Midway was now evolving into a grim acceptance. The Japanese Navy had witnessed not just the loss of ships, but the end of an era. And they would soon face that reality in battle once again. For in the waters of the Solomon Islands, those ghost American carriers were about to return, not as survivors, but as executioners. August 1942. The waters around the Solomon Islands shimmered with heat and anticipation. For months, the Pacific had been eerily quiet, the lull after Midway's storm. But deep within that silence, two great fleets were again moving toward each other. The Americans had landed Marines on Guadalcanal, a jungle-covered island with a half-built Japanese airfield. Its capture shocked Tokyo. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States had seized the initiative, launching an offensive deep into Japanese-held territory. Admiral Yamamoto ordered an immediate counterstrike. He dispatched carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, survivors of earlier battles, alongside light carriers and surface escorts. Their objective: annihilate the American carriers supporting the invasion. But when the Japanese search planes found their targets, disbelief rippled through the fleet. The enemy carriers, they reported, Enterprise, Saratoga, and Hornet, were ships that Japanese intelligence believed sunk or crippled. Officers stared at the reconnaissance photos in silence. "Impossible," one captain murmured. Yet there they were, their flight decks alive with aircraft, their squadrons bearing familiar insignia. Teetered, Imperial Navy had entered a nightmare of its own making, a war against an enemy that refused to stay destroyed. The first clash came on August 24, 1942, in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Dawn broke with heavy clouds and swells that rocked the carriers. Scout planes launched at first light, engines coughing in the humid air. Hours later, the first reports came. Enemy carriers spotted, bearing Northeast American task forces under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid prepared for battle. Below decks, crews worked methodically, arming bombs, fueling aircraft, checking control surfaces. Every man aboard Enterprise and Saratoga knew the risk. The Japanese were still considered superior in aerial combat, but this time the Americans had the numbers, radar coordination, and hard-earned experience. When the attacks began, the sky erupted into chaos. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes descended in tight formations, met by volleys of anti-aircraft fire so dense it seemed to turn the air into steel. Enterprise was hit twice, her decks torn open, flames racing across the surface. But her crew did not abandon her. Firefighting teams, veterans of Coral Sea and Midway, worked in choking smoke, sealing bulkheads, dragging hoses across molten steel. Within hours, the fires were contained. At the same time, American air groups struck back. Dive bombers from Saratoga and Enterprise broke through Japanese defenses and hit the carrier Ryujo, engulfing her in explosions that sent black columns skyward. Within minutes, she was listing fatally. The battle raged for hours, each side losing planes in staggering numbers. But when night fell, it was the Japanese fleet that withdrew. Their offensive halted, their carrier Ryujo gone, and their air strength depleted. For Japan, the engagement was more than a tactical setback. It marked the moment they realized the full scale of American resilience. The same enemy carriers thought sunk at Coral Sea, and Midway had not only returned, they had fought again, and won. Messages transmitted back to Japan carried the weight of disbelief. Enemy carriers operating as before, combat effectiveness undiminished. To the crews aboard the Shokaku and Zuikaku, it was as if they were fighting an immortal fleet. Each time they struck, the enemy reappeared stronger, more numerous. That night, as Enterprise limped away from the Solomon Islands under her own power, repair crews already began patching her scars. Men worked by flashlight, welding metal over bomb holes as the ship moved. In Tokyo, Japanese naval intelligence began drafting new assessments, grim reports acknowledging that America's repair and replacement capacity was beyond calculation. The myth of Japanese naval superiority was unraveling, yet the Imperial Navy did not yield. Plans were already underway for a new operation. One final attempt to reclaim air and sea control near Guadalcanal. The next clash would be even bloodier, fought under skies choked with smoke and flame. And once again, the sunken American carriers would be there, waiting. October 1942. 2 months after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the struggle for Guadalcanal had become a war within a war. Every day, American Marines clung to a fragile perimeter around Henderson Field, while Japanese reinforcements tried to land under the cover of darkness. Control of the airfield meant control of the Solomon Sea, and that, in turn, meant control of the Pacific. Both sides knew it. Both sides were exhausted, but Japan still believed that one massive strike could turn the tide. Admiral Nagumo, haunted by the ghosts of Midway, once again led the Imperial Navy's carriers into battle. His task force included the veterans Shokaku and Zuikaku, along with the light carrier Zuiho. Their orders: destroy the remaining American carriers supporting Guadalcanal's defense. On the morning of October 26, 1942, reconnaissance planes spotted them. 3 American carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the newly arrived South Dakota battleship providing cover. For the Japanese observers, it was like déjà vu. The same names, the same silhouettes, the same threat they thought had been erased. The battle that followed, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, was brutal, chaotic, and fought with the desperation of men who sensed history closing in. At 9 a.m. both fleets launched their air groups almost simultaneously. Dozens of bombers and torpedo planes clawed into the sky, bound for one another. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of engine oil. Clouds rolled low, giving fleeting cover to attackers. Japanese dive bombers found Enterprise first. 2 direct hits smashed through her deck, igniting fires and hurling debris into the sky. Her flight deck buckled, smoke pouring from her hangar. But again, the ship refused to die. Damage control parties swarmed over the burning deck, sealing ruptured fuel lines, jettisoning munitions. Within an hour, aircraft were launching again from her forward catapult. On the horizon, Hornet fought her own battle. She was struck by dive bombers and torpedoes in a relentless sequence. 9 hits in all. Fires raged uncontrollably. Power failed. Yet her gunners continued firing until the last of her ammunition was gone. Eventually, she was abandoned, and later scuttled by American destroyers to prevent capture. For the Japanese, it was a Pyrrhic victory. Hornet was lost, but Japan's air groups suffered catastrophic casualties. Out of over 200 attacking aircraft, only a fraction returned. Many of those pilots had been trained since before the war. The last of the elite. When the battle ended, Enterprise remained afloat, battered, scarred, and listing, but alive. Within weeks, she was patched up and back in action. In Tokyo, the news of Santa Cruz was delivered in careful tones. Technically, it was a victory. 2 American carriers heavily damaged or sunk. Yet Japan's own carrier air arm had been decimated. The pilots who had once dominated the Pacific skies were gone, replaced by hastily trained recruits. Yamamoto read the after-action reports aboard Yamato in silence. He understood what few others dared to voice. Japan had just won its last carrier victory. Every engagement from this point onward would bleed the Imperial Navy faster than it could recover. When Enterprise reappeared off Guadalcanal weeks later, patched, repainted, and flying new squadrons, disbelief turned to despair. Japanese officers joked bitterly that she was the ship that would not die. But the truth was no joke. America had achieved what Japan never could, a system that turned damage into renewal, defeat into fuel. From that moment, Japan's carrier fleet was no longer the hunter, it was the hunted. As the wreckage of Hornet drifted beneath the Pacific swells, American engineers were already finishing her replacement. A new Yorktown, a new Essex, a new Bunker Hill. The factories of Norfolk, Brooklyn, and San Francisco had become extensions of the battlefield. The Imperial Navy had no such lifeline. For every ship lost, a piece of Japan's war-fighting soul sank with it. Santa Cruz marked the true turning point of the Pacific War. Not just strategically, but spiritually. The Japanese Navy, once master of the ocean, now faced an enemy that could fight forever. And as Enterprise steamed slowly back toward Pearl Harbor, her decks scorched but her flag still flying, the message to Tokyo was unmistakable. The Americans were not just rebuilding, they were returning, stronger each time. When the smoke cleared over the Santa Cruz Islands, the Pacific had changed forever. The Imperial Japanese Navy had won a tactical victory, but at a price that would never be repaid. In Tokyo, the newspapers hailed the destruction of Hornet and the crippling of Enterprise as proof that Japan still ruled the seas. Photos of flight decks wreathed in smoke were printed as symbols of triumph. Yet behind closed doors, the admirals knew the truth. The core of Japan's naval aviation, its most irreplaceable resource, had been shattered. Out of 199 aircraft launched that day, barely 100 returned. Of those, many were damaged beyond repair. More than 140 highly trained aviators, men who had survived Coral Sea and Midway, were gone. These were not just pilots. They were veterans, instructors, the living memory of Japan's carrier warfare doctrine. No ship could replace them. Meanwhile, in Pearl Harbor's dry docks, Enterprise was undergoing yet another resurrection. Her decks still smelled of charred steel and aviation fuel. Welders worked around the clock, sealing bomb craters and replacing bulkheads. In just 2 weeks, she was battle-ready again. Her aircraft elevators functioning, her decks repainted, her flag raised high. Admiral William Halsey, who had taken command of South Pacific forces in October, called her return a miracle. To the men on Guadalcanal, Enterprise became a myth made real. They called her the Big E. Whenever her planes appeared overhead, morale surged. "The Navy's back," one Marine wrote in his diary, "and so is hope." For the Japanese forces fighting on the island, the effect was the opposite. Reports of American carrier aircraft striking again so soon after Santa Cruz caused disbelief. Some soldiers thought it was a bluff. Others whispered that the Americans had ghost ships. But there was no ghost, only the power of American industry. While Japan struggled to replace a handful of destroyed aircraft, the United States was launching new carriers at an astonishing pace. The massive Essex-class carriers like Bunker Hill, Lexington, CV-16, and Yorktown, CV-10, were already fitting out. Each could carry 90 planes, supported by thousands of trained pilots coming out of the newly expanded flight schools across America. The war of attrition, one Japan had hoped to avoid, was now inescapable. By early 1943, American carrier power began to surge forward. The lessons of Santa Cruz were analyzed in meticulous detail: radar coordination, air group defense tactics, damage control procedures. Every failure became a blueprint for improvement. Japan, on the other hand, began to fall behind technologically and logistically. Fuel shortages worsened. Pilot training time was slashed from 700 hours to barely 100. Carrier decks, once crowded with veterans, now launched boys barely out of high school. Yet even as the balance tilted, the legend of Enterprise continued to grow. By mid-1943, she had fought in more major engagements than any other carrier in history, surviving damage after damage, strike after strike. Her presence became psychological warfare. Japanese pilots were said to curse her name before missions. To the men of the Pacific, the American carrier fleet had become a symbol of inevitability, a tide that no bomb could stop. And behind every new hull number rolling off the slips, Japan could see its own fate reflected, a nation being slowly surrounded by the very carriers it had once sought to destroy. The invincible Imperial Navy now faced an opponent whose strength multiplied with every battle. But the Pacific was not yet finished testing them, because within a year, another decisive confrontation, fought on the open sea near the Mariana Islands, would prove beyond doubt that Japan's carrier power was gone forever. By mid-1943, the Pacific Ocean had become a graveyard of sunken steel. Beneath the waves rested the twisted carcasses of once proud carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Hornet. Each had carried hundreds of men. Each had once dictated the tempo of the war. Now they were tombs of ambition. Yet one ship, scarred, weary, and unstoppable, still roamed the waves. The USS Enterprise. When she returned to Pearl Harbor after Santa Cruz, she was no longer just a carrier. She was a legend forged in flame. Her battle honors stretched across every major engagement of the Pacific War. Each bomb scar on her hull told the story of survival, of a navy that refused to die. In early 1944, Enterprise sailed again into the Central Pacific as part of the fast carrier task forces supporting the invasion of the Marshall Islands. By now, the transformation of American sea power was complete. Dozens of new Essex-class carriers filled the horizon. Each one was larger, faster, and deadlier. Each a monument to industrial might. When these ships met the remnants of the Imperial Navy at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the result was one of the most lopsided engagements in naval history. Japan launched more than 400 carrier aircraft in desperate waves, but this time the skies belonged to the Americans. Radar-guided fighters intercepted them long before they reached the fleet. Veteran U.S. pilots, trained through rigorous programs that Japan could no longer match, tore through the formations with devastating efficiency. By nightfall, over 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The American losses, fewer than 50. The Japanese called it Taiho no Ichi go Sakusen, Operation Eigo. The Americans called it something simpler. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was the final act of Japan's carrier dream. The surviving Japanese carriers, stripped of their air groups, limped back toward home waters. They would never again strike in force. The Imperial Navy, once the spearhead of Asia's maritime empire, had been reduced to a hollow shell. For Japan's admirals, the psychological blow was devastating. They had built their strategy around the idea that quality, superior ships, superior pilots, superior spirit, could overcome numbers. But in the Pacific, quantity had become quality. American shipyards and refineries were producing more than any navy in history, and every ship seemed to carry the same echo. The echo of Enterprise. When the war finally reached its final months in 1945, Enterprise was still there, launching strikes over Okinawa, escorting bombers toward Japan's home islands, rescuing downed pilots from the sea. She had been hit by kamikazes, scorched by explosions, and yet she sailed on. On May 14, 1945, A suicide plane crashed into her flight deck, killing 14 and wounding 34. She limped home once more, smoke curling from her scars. When she entered Puget Sound for repairs, the men on shore lined the docks in silence. Some saluted. Others simply watched. The war was almost over. And so was the age of the carrier duels that had defined it. In the years that followed, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist. The ships that had once carried the rising sun were gone, sunk, scrapped, or surrendered. The Pacific that Japan had sought to dominate became the stage for a new balance of power, one anchored by American carriers, each descended from the ship that refused to die. USS Enterprise earned 20 battle stars, more than any other U.S. warship in World War II. She was decommissioned in 1947 and later dismantled for scrap, but to those who fought beside her, she never truly disappeared. For every veteran who saw her return after being sunk, for every Marine who looked up and saw her planes, Enterprise remained what she had always been, a symbol of endurance, rebirth, and the unbreakable will of a nation that learned how to fight back. Her steel was gone, but her legacy endured, echoing across every carrier deck that came after. And somewhere in the depths of the Pacific, the admirals who once believed she was finished would understand at last. The Americans hadn't just built ships, they had built a force that could rise from the sea itself. History remembers ships not for their size, but for their spirit. And in the long story of naval warfare, few spirits burned as fiercely as that of the USS Enterprise. She was born in an age when Japan's empire seemed unstoppable, when the rising sun stretched across the Pacific and American forces were retreating on every front. Yet through every defeat, every fire, every near sinking, Enterprise refused to vanish. Each time she was struck down, she returned stronger, carrying not only bombs and aircraft, but the weight of an entire nation's resolve. The Japanese Navy never truly understood what they were fighting against. To them, ships were weapons, beautiful, powerful instruments of destruction. To the Americans, ships like Enterprise became something more. They were living extensions of a people learning to master total war, to merge technology, logistics, and human courage into a single unstoppable force. Midway, Santa Cruz, Guadalcanal, the Marianas, each battle etched the same truth deeper into history. That endurance, not perfection, decides the fate of wars. Japan's carriers burned brightly, but briefly. Enterprise endured, scarred, repaired, and reborn again and again. In the silence that followed 1945, Japan's admirals would look back on those years with both pride and disbelief. They had built one of the most formidable naval forces in history, and yet they were defeated by an enemy whose power grew every time it was wounded. For the sailors and airmen who served aboard Enterprise, the war became a lifetime of memory, of roaring engines, burning skies, and the endless horizon of the Pacific. Many would later say that when the war ended, it felt as though the ship herself had carried them home. And so the story of Enterprise became more than a tale of steel and strategy. It became a mirror for the entire Pacific War, a war where destruction bred renewal, and where the will to rebuild proved mightier than any weapon. The Japanese Navy was shocked to see the American carriers return after being sunk, but what they were truly witnessing, in that gray, smoke-filled ocean, was the moment Japan's empire began to fade, and America's resilience rose in its place.